Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues.
Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Miss Marple as she stumbles upon a recipe that was never meant to feed the living. It wasn't written in a cookbook, passed down by a neighbor, or found in any kitchen drawer. It was whispered from beyond, leading her to bake a pie for a ghost who refused to rest. Stay with me till the end, because what she finds inside that kitchen is more than a haunting. It's a revelation. So, pour yourself a cup of tea and settle in, because today's mystery will leave you questioning what truly lingers after the oven cools. Chapter 1. A pleasant day turned grim. It was one of those deceptively tranquil mornings in St. Mildred's, the sort that seemed almost determined to lull its inhabitants into a false sense of security. The early summer air was warm but not oppressive, carrying the faint, mingled scents of roses, fresh bread from Mrs. Pargeter's bakery, and the sharp tang of newly varnished railings outside the post office. Birds chattered industriously in the hedgerows, and the postman, young Billy Rawlings, whistled off-key as he went about his rounds. In short, it was the sort of day in which nothing dreadful could possibly happen, or so everyone thought. Miss Marple had been up since 6, as was her habit, tending to her roses before the heat became too much for them. She had a pie cooling on the window ledge of her kitchen, apple and blackcurrant, with a lattice top that would have pleased even the most fastidious of housekeepers. The pie was not for her. It was meant for Mrs. Agatha Prynne, an elderly widow who lived in the converted coach house at the edge of the common. Mrs. Prynne had, only 2 days earlier, told Miss Marple in a matter-of-fact tone that she was expecting a visit from her late husband. Not a dream. Dear Mrs. Prynne had said, her eyes bright as she poured tea. A visitation. He always came back for his favorite pie. Most people in St. Mildred's would have dismissed such a remark as the harmless fancy of old age. But Miss Marple had learned long ago never to dismiss anything. People said curious things for all sorts of reasons, some innocent, others decidedly not. And Mrs. Prynne, despite her fondness for gossip, had never been prone to whimsy. So it was that, pie in hand, Miss Marple set out along the sun-dappled path toward the coach house, her eyes noting the subtle changes in the village as she passed. Old Mr. Simpkins was mending the gate to the churchyard, muttering under his breath about nails that were better in the old days. Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, was rearranging the flowers outside the parish hall for that afternoon's charity rummage sale. Nothing, on the surface, suggested anything amiss, and yet Miss Marple had learned to listen to the faintest notes of discord in an otherwise harmonious scene. Today, she noticed the uneasy way Mrs. Price kept glancing up the lane toward the coach house, as though expecting or dreading to see something. When Miss Marple reached Mrs. Prine's gate, she found it standing slightly ajar. That was unusual. Mrs. Prynne was a stickler for latches and bolts, having once chased away a pair of inquisitive children who had tried to pick gooseberries from her garden. The path to the front door was still bordered by neat rows of lavender, their scent heavy in the still air, but the door itself stood half open. Mrs. Prynne? Miss Marple called gently, stepping inside. She was met not by a reply, but by the low ticking of the long case clock in the hall. The sitting room looked precisely as it had on Miss Marple's last visit: the crocheted antimacassars, the porcelain spaniels on the mantel, the faded but meticulously clean rug. On the table, 2 teacups sat as if awaiting use, one chipped and older, the other a fine china cup Miss Marple did not recall seeing before. She found Mrs. Prynne in the kitchen. The widow was seated in her high-backed chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the far wall. At first glance she might have been merely resting, but the stillness was too complete, the air too heavy. On the table before her was a plate with a single slice of pie, untouched. Miss Marple set her own pie down and moved closer. Mrs. Prine's eyes were open, but they no longer saw. A faint, sour-sweet smell lingered in the air, not unlike almonds, but sharper, more bitter. It was only then that Miss Marple noticed the second cup of tea on the kitchen table. The tea was still warm, The news traveled through St. Mildred's faster than the church bell could toll. By the time Constable Merriweather arrived, flustered, red-faced, and clearly uncertain how to proceed, a small crowd had already gathered outside the coach house. Mrs. Price whispered urgently to Mrs. Simpkins. Mr. Godfrey, who ran the tobacconist's, peered unabashedly through the hedge. Even Billy Rawlings abandoned his post round to hover near the gate, his bicycle leaning awkwardly against the lavender bushes. The constable, after a hesitant examination, sent young Billy pedaling furiously to fetch Inspector Craddock from Much Benham. In the meantime, he urged everyone to clear off and give the deceased some dignity, though the effect was minimal. Miss Marple, having given her statement in her usual calm, precise way, stood a little apart from the rest. Her mind, as ever, was quietly sorting details. The ajar gate, the warm tea, the second cup, Mrs. Prine's odd remark about expecting her late husband, and that unmistakable bitter scent. By midday, Inspector Craddock had taken charge. He was a tall, spare man with a manner that suggested he preferred tidy facts to troubling possibilities. Poisoning was suspected, likely cyanide, though confirmation would take time. As Craddock questioned the onlookers, Miss Marple noted the subtle flickers of expression that passed between them. Mrs. Price's hands trembled as she gave her account. Though she claimed she had not seen Mrs. Prynne in a week, Mr. Godfrey was unusually jovial, almost relieved, which struck Miss Marple as worthy of note. And young Billy Rawlings, usually talkative, seemed unusually quiet. Glancing toward the coach house with something that looked like guilt, Craddock, for his part, seemed convinced it was a simple matter. These elderly folk, Miss Marple, he said in a low voice, sometimes they get notions into their heads. Could have been a mistake, took something she shouldn't have. Perhaps, Miss Marple said mildly, though one wonders, in that case, why the other cup of tea? Craddock frowned. Yes, well, we'll look into that. By late afternoon, the village had settled into the peculiar hush that follows a sudden death. Curtains twitched. The clink of teacups sounded overly loud in tidy parlors, and inevitably, the stories began to spread. Some said Mrs. Prynne had been seeing a man in secret, an old flame, perhaps, come to call on her. Others insisted it was connected to the quarrel she'd had with her niece over a disputed inheritance. There was even a whispered suggestion that Mrs. Prynne had been mixed up in something shady during the war, and that her past had finally caught up with her. Miss Marple listened to it all with polite attention. She knew from long experience that village gossip was like a tangled skein of wool knots, and loose ends everywhere, but if one was patient enough, the pattern always revealed itself. That evening, as she sat in her parlor with her knitting, Miss Marple thought again of the pie cooling on her own windowsill that morning. Mrs. Prynne had been expecting someone who would share tea, and perhaps a slice of pie. Someone she had trusted enough to invite into her home, and that someone, Miss Marple suspected, had brought with them more than polite conversation. Outside, the twilight deepened over St. Mildred's. Somewhere, in the stillness, the murderer of Agatha Prynne was sipping their own evening tea, confident they had left no trace. Miss Marple, her needles clicking softly, already knew they were wrong. Chapter 2. The village reacts. The following morning, St. Mildred's was humming with the sort of quiet urgency usually reserved for a royal visit, or the announcement of a new postmistress. The death of Mrs. Agatha Prynne had provided the village with both a tragedy and an irresistible puzzle to things that, together, could keep tongues wagging for weeks. The epicenter of speculation was, naturally, Mrs. Pargeter's bakery. Her currant buns were excellent, but the true draw for customers that day was the opportunity to exchange the latest version of events over the counter. By 9:30, every table by the window was occupied, teacups steaming and voices lowered in that particular conspiratorial tone that promised more drama than truth. Mrs. Price, the vicar's wife, was in particularly fine form, leaning across the table to whisper to Mrs. Simpkins, "Mark my words, it was something to do with that niece of hers, Helen. You know how she can be so impatient for her due. Poor Agatha often said she feared being left quite alone in that house." Mrs. Simpkins, whose capacity for believing the worst of others was matched only by her fondness for seed cake, nodded sagely. "I heard Helen's been in a bit of a pickle financially. Took on some investment went badly. So they say. In another corner, Mr. Godfrey, the tobacconist, was holding court with two of his regular customers. Couldn't have been natural cousins, he declared, though nobody had actually asked his opinion. Saw the constable's face myself, grim as anything. And I'll tell you something else. I saw a gentleman not from round here walking toward the coach house the day before she died. Tall fellow, dark coat, looked like he didn't want to be seen. Miss Marple, having stopped in for a small loaf of bread, listened with polite interest. She neither encouraged nor dismissed these theories. Experience had taught her that gossip often carried small fragments of truth, though never in their original shape. She paid for her loaf, exchanged a few civil words with Mrs. Pargeter, and stepped out into the sunshine, across the road. The green was alive, with small knots of people pretending to admire the flower beds, while trading information. Billy Rawlings was lingering there too, looking as though he would rather be anywhere else. Miss Marple approached him gently. "You were the one to fetch Inspector Craddock yesterday, weren't you?" she asked. Billy shifted from foot to foot. "Yes, Miss Marple. I didn't like going in, to tell the truth. Never seen someone, you know, gone like that before. I dare say it was a shock," she said, her tone as kind as her blue eyes were shrewd. "Still, you're young, you recover from shocks more quickly. Did you see anyone else about, on your way to Mrs. Prine's?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No, just Mrs. Price in her garden. Oh, and Mr. Godfrey, but he was closing up his shop." Miss Marple let him go without pressing further. She had learned that people, especially the young, often remembered things better after they'd had time to forget they were supposed to keep them quiet. At the same hour, Inspector Craddock was making his own inquiries. In the vicarage drawing room, he sat opposite Helen Prynne, the late Mrs. Prine's niece. Helen was in her early 30s, with fine features and an air of nervous energy. She insisted she had been in Bath at the time of her aunt's death, visiting a friend. Craddock made a note of it, but his expression suggested he was reserving judgment. "I can't imagine why anyone would harm Aunt Agatha," Helen said, her hands twisting in her lap. "She was difficult at times, yes, but that was only because she liked things just so." Craddock, who had heard similar descriptions applied to women who could make enemies at a remarkable rate, asked about visitors. Helen frowned. She did mention someone was coming to see her this week. She called him an old friend, but when I asked who, she laughed and said I'd find out soon enough. I thought it was just her way of teasing. That, Miss Marple reflected later when Craddock repeated it to her, was a most curious remark. People rarely teased about visitors unless there was something unusual in the connection. By afternoon, the gossip had begun to acquire more color than fact. Someone had claimed that the mysterious visitor was a fortune-teller from Brighton. Someone else swore it was a retired colonel who had once courted Mrs. Prynne. Both accounts were confidently repeated in the King's Arms, where Mr. Simpkins was enjoying the role of village historian, dredging up every half-remembered tale of Mrs. Prine's younger days. Miss Marple, meanwhile, took her tea at home and thought about the teacups. There was a symmetry to tea drinking, a small domestic ritual that was, in its way, as revealing as handwriting. People had habits about which cup they used, how they poured, the amount of milk or sugar. The chipped cup in the sitting room, and the fine china one in the kitchen. There was a story there, though she did not yet know its ending. That evening, a light rain began to fall, pattering softly against the windows of the village hall where the charity rummage sale was still being cleared away. Miss Marple, passing by, saw Mrs. Price speaking in low tones to Mr. Godfrey. He was shaking his head and gesturing toward the lane that led to the coach house. They stopped abruptly when they saw her, greeting her with exaggerated cheerfulness. Miss Marple responded in kind, her manner warm and unassuming, but her mind quietly filing away the fact that neither had mentioned being near the coach house on the day of the death, yet both plainly had reason to be curious about it now. By nightfall, the story of Mrs. Prine's last hours had been told and retold in so many variations that even those who had been present began to wonder which details were true. Only one point was certain: someone had been with her when she died. Whether that someone had meant her harm was the question dividing the village. Miss Marple, settling into her armchair with her knitting, did not trouble herself with divisions. She knew that human nature was much the same in St. Mildred's as it was anywhere else. People concealed, distorted, or exaggerated the truth for reasons that had nothing to do with murder, though. Murder often took root in the soil of smaller deceptions. Somewhere among the chatter, the glances, and the too careful silences lay the answer. And Miss Marple, with the patience of a gardener waiting for seedlings to break the surface, intended to find it. Chapter 3: The first clues and suspicions. Sinspert Craddock returned to St. Mildred's the next morning, bringing with him the slightly frayed patience of a man whose investigation was being pulled in three directions at once: by evidence, by gossip, and by the stubborn conviction of Miss Marple. The police, working from the practical outward, had begun by noting the obvious. Mrs. Prynne had died after taking tea, and the scent detected by Miss Marple had indeed proved to be cyanide. The source, however, was still in question. There had been no bottle or packet found in the kitchen, no sign of carelessness in her cupboards, which meant the poison had likely been brought into the house. And recently, we've narrowed the list to those who saw her in the last 48 hours. Craddock told Miss Marple when she stopped by the coach house that morning. Her niece, Helen, Mrs. Price, Mr. Godfrey, who claims he delivered some tobacco as a favor, and the mysterious visitor Helen mentioned if he exists. Miss Marple's eyes went to the table where the two teacups had been found. The chipped one was there, in its saucer, but the fine china cup was gone. "Did you take the other cup for testing?" she asked mildly. Craddock looked puzzled. "Other cup? The chipped one's all we found. You're certain there was another?" "I am rarely certain of things, Inspector," Miss Marple said, "but I do remember a fine china cup in the kitchen. Delicate pink rim, slightly worn gold band, quite out of place in Mrs. Prynne's daily service." Craddock made a note, frowning. "Could have been removed before we arrived." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "Could have been." The postman, young Billy Rawlings, proved unexpectedly helpful later that morning when Miss Marple, under the pretext of asking after her nephew's magazine subscription, engaged him in conversation outside the post office. "Funny thing," Billy said. "I saw Mr. Godfrey coming from the coach house side gate about an hour before Mrs. Price says. She saw Mrs. Prynne that day. He didn't have his shop bag with him, so I don't think he'd been delivering tobacco." Miss Marple tucked this away without comment. It was a habit of hers to let the facts rest, like pastry dough, before attempting to roll them into shape. Inside the coach house, Constable Merriweather was making a clumsy inventory of Mrs. Prynne's belongings. In the process, he had discovered a small, locked drawer in her writing desk. When Craddock opened it, they found a series of neatly tied bundles of letters. Most were unremarkable holiday greetings, bills, old receipts, but one was addressed in a bold, unfamiliar hand and dated only a week ago. The letter, when read aloud, was vague yet oddly urgent. "My dear Agatha, I have at last decided to take up your invitation. Matters press upon me, and I believe our meeting could be to both our advantages. I shall call upon you on Thursday, as you suggested. Please see that the tea is ready, and that we may speak without interruption. Yours, as ever." "Our bar," Craddock repeated, "means nothing to me." Miss Marple, on the other hand, had already begun to sift through her mental card index of acquaintances and village history. "It is curious," she murmured, "how rarely people who sign their letters with an initial are altogether above board." By midday, Craddock had decided to question Mrs. Price again. She insisted that she had seen Mrs. Prynne in her garden on the morning of her death, trimming lavender. When asked whether she had gone up to the house, she hesitated. "I did call in, just for a moment," she admitted. "I had a basket of scones for her, but she said she was expecting a guest, and I wouldn't want to intrude." Miss Marple, who was present for this exchange, noted the basket of scones was nowhere to be found in the kitchen or pantry that evening. Walking home, Miss Marple allowed her thoughts to wander over the threads she had gathered. The missing china cup, Mr. Godfrey's unexplained visit, Mrs. Price's vanished scones, the letter from R, all small, seemingly disconnected matters. Yet together they began to form the faint outline of a pattern. The trouble with patterns, she knew, was that they could just as easily mislead as reveal, especially if someone clever was arranging them for just that purpose. In the public rooms of the King's Arms, Speculation had shifted focus to the possibility of a stranger being involved. Tom Jarvis, the landlord, swore he had seen a tall man in a dark coat in the village 3 days earlier, though no one else could place him. Some argued this was the R of the letter. Others suggested he might be a traveling salesman or a debt collector. Helen Prynne, for her part, had been seen twice that day, moving through the village with an air of strained dignity, politely rebuffing anyone who tried to offer condolences. Miss Marple, observing her from a distance, thought she detected the same tautness in Helen's expression that she had once seen in a young woman at a church social. One who had just learned her fiancé had been speaking to another girl. Later that night, as she sat by her window knitting, Miss Marple recalled Mrs. Pryne's own words. He always did come back for his favorite pie. If taken literally, they were nonsensical. The late Mr. Prynne had been dead for 15 years, but people often spoke in metaphor when they feared speaking plainly. Perhaps she had been referring to an old acquaintance, one with whom she had shared more than pie, and perhaps that acquaintance had come back, not for fond memories, but for something else entirely. In the morning, Miss Marple decided she would call on Mr. Godfrey. He had always been a civil neighbor, but she could not help wondering why a man in the tobacconist trade would pay visits without his wares, and why, in speaking of Mrs. Prynne, his relief had seemed greater than his sorrow. Chapter 4. Miss Marple quietly observed. Next morning was bright, with a soft breeze stirring the hedgerows and sending a faint rustle through the village. Miss Marple, having decided that her roses could fend for themselves for a few hours, set out to call on a few neighbors. Though the real purpose of her stroll was to see rather more than she intended to be seen. It was one of her guiding principles that people behaved differently when they believed they were unobserved, and differently still when they thought the observer harmless. She had long since perfected the art of being regarded as a dear, slightly absent-minded old lady whose primary concerns were lace patterns and church flowers. Her first stop was the tobacconist's. The shop bell tinkled as she entered, and Mr. Godfrey looked up from behind the counter with his usual smooth courtesy. "Miss Marple, always a pleasure. More of that special blend for your nephew, was it?" No, just passing by," she said, examining a display of tobacco tins. "Though I did want to ask after your health, Mr. Godfrey. I noticed you've been looking rather tired of late." He chuckled politely. "Business keeps one on one's feet, but I manage." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes drifting not idly, though it seemed so to the counter behind him. There was a small porcelain cup on a shelf, of fine china, pale pink with a worn gold rim. Its twin, she was certain, had sat on Mrs. Pryne's kitchen table 2 mornings ago. "That's a lovely cup," she said mildly. "Gift from a supplier," Godfrey replied, a fraction too quickly. "Haven't used it in years." She smiled, as though satisfied, but made a mental note of the faint tea stain visible at the bottom. From the tobacconist's, she made her way to the vicarage. Mrs. Price greeted her with an effusive warmth that was only slightly undermined by the fact that her eyes kept flicking toward the kitchen door. "I hope you didn't find my manner abrupt when I saw you the other day," Mrs. Price began. "I was quite out of sorts. Agatha's death came as such a shock." Miss Marple murmured her agreement, allowing the vicar's wife to fill the silence. People, she had found, had a tendency to explain themselves most thoroughly when they weren't being asked to. "I took her those scones, of course," Mrs. Price went on, "but she hardly touched them. I dare say she was saving her appetite for her guest." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes drawn to the sideboard where a shallow basket sat, its lining cloth still faintly dusted with flour. "Did you bake more afterwards?" Mrs. Price blinked. No, I haven't had the time." "Ah," Miss Marple said pleasantly, and let the matter drop. But she did not fail to note that the basket looked as though it had been in use very recently indeed. Her third visit was to the post office, where she found Billy Rawlings weighing a parcel. He looked up quickly when she entered, almost guiltily. "Morning, Miss Marple." "Good morning, Billy. I was just wondering, did you happen to deliver anything to Mrs. Prynne the day before she died?" He hesitated. "Just a letter. Handed it over myself." She seemed pleased, almost nervous. "And did you notice the handwriting? Bold, slanted, like it was written in a hurry. Just the one letter in the corner R. Miss Marple nodded slowly. The letter in Mrs. Prine's desk had indeed matched that description. She thanked him and stepped out, letting the breeze ruffle her hat brim as she walked. By mid-afternoon, she had returned home, made herself a modest tea, and sat in her parlor with her knitting. But her thoughts were not on the wool. Godfrey had lied subtly, but enough for her to see it about the use of that china cup. Mrs. Price's scone basket suggested something had been removed in haste. Billy's account confirmed the letter's rival, and the fact that Mrs. Prynne had been expecting someone known only as R seemed to tie them all together, though the string between them was still too faint to follow. At dusk, she attended the evening service at St. Mildred's, more for the opportunity to watch faces than for the hymns. Helen Prynne was there, dressed in somber gray, her eyes downcast. Yet when the vicar spoke of her aunt's generosity of spirit, a tiny tightening appeared at the corner of her mouth. Not grief, Miss Marple thought, but irritation. Godfrey sat 2 rows behind, glancing toward Helen once. Quickly, Mrs. Price was in the front pew, hands clasped in outward devotion, though she seemed intent on avoiding the tobacconist's eye. Miss Marple sat very still, knitting needles, silent in her lap. People, she knew, told you the truth in the way they looked at one another far more readily than in the way they spoke. When she returned home, the moon was already rising, pale and watchful over the thatched rooftops. Miss Marple stood for a moment at her gate, thinking. Human nature, she reflected, was remarkably consistent. In another village, years ago, there had been a case involving a widow, an inheritance, and an old friend who came calling. The friend had not been what he seemed, and the widow had paid dearly for trusting him. But in that instance, too, it had been the small, homely details: a missing teacup, a hastily washed plate that had given the game away. The trouble was, those same small details could just as easily be planted by someone else, and so Miss Marple resolved to wait, to watch, and to let the village's restless talk carry the loose ends to her. When people lied, it was rarely the grand statements that betrayed them. It was the tiny stitches, pulled too tight or left too loose, that eventually unraveled the whole. Chapter 5. A Tapestry of Shadows. The next morning dawned pale and reluctant, the kind of light that seemed hesitant to enter the old corridors of Grange House. Miss Marple, sitting by the drawing-room window, took her tea in small, thoughtful sips, watching the fog that lingered over the gardens like a hesitant ghost. The air carried that uneasy hush particular to houses holding secrets, a quietness that was not peace, but concealment. Mrs. Redley entered, her composure precise as ever, though her hands bore the faint trembling of someone who had not slept well. She offered a polite greeting, but Miss Marple caught the fractional delay before her smile, the faint hesitation in her step. Such things, to the untrained eye, were nothing. To Miss Marple, they were signposts. Such a pity, Mrs. Redley murmured, about last night's unpleasantness. The constable was here until past midnight, asking his questions. I do hope the matter is resolved swiftly. It quite unsettles the household. Miss Marple gave her a kindly nod. I dare say it has been disruptive, though I often think, Mrs. Redley, that disruption is but the outer sign of deeper disquiet. There was a flicker, a tightening about Mrs. Redley's eyes before she excused herself. Miss Marple watched her leave, cataloging yet another small piece in a puzzle that, so far, revealed only the faintest image. By mid-morning, Inspector Cray had returned, his manner brisk but not unfriendly. He had taken, Miss Marple thought, a professional liking to her, the kind of wary respect policemen often held for older women who seemed far too aware of things they had no business knowing. I've been over the grounds again, he said in a low tone. Found some footprints leading toward the west garden wall. Trouble is, the soil's damp enough to take an impression, but too crumbly to hold a clear one. Could be anyone's. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked in steady rhythm. Could be, Inspector. But I imagine there are not many in the household who would choose the west garden path in the dark. Especially last night, with the air so heavy and still. The inspector gave her a searching look. You think it's someone inside? I think, Miss Marple replied, that houses such as this rarely allow their mysteries to come from the outside. After the inspector left, she wandered into the library, where Eleanor Redley was bent over a desk, her hands occupied with letters. Eleanor's movements were neat, but Miss Marple noted the faint ink smudge on her thumb, the kind that came from sealing envelopes in haste. "My dear," Miss Marple said gently, "you must have quite a task keeping up the correspondence for a house of this size." Eleanor looked up, a trace of tension behind her polite expression. "It is part of my duty. My aunt dislikes business letters, so they fall to me. I assure you, there's nothing romantic about it." Miss Marple smiled faintly, filing the remark away. People often revealed more than they realized when they rushed to disclaim. Later, in the dim corridor leading toward the servants' wing, Miss Marple happened upon Mrs. Finch, the housekeeper, speaking in low tones to the gardener, Mr. Hales. Both fell abruptly silent when they saw her. Mrs. Finch, regaining her composure, offered a stiff nod. "Just discussing the roses, Miss Marple," she said, a little too quickly. "Ah, roses," Miss Marple replied mildly. "So very beautiful, but so often plagued by hidden thorns." She did not miss the faint flush that crossed Mrs. Finch's cheeks before she hurried away. By the time luncheon was served, the atmosphere in Grange House had shifted again. It was as though the walls themselves had grown more watchful. Miss Marple listened to the table conversation with the air of one only half attentive, while in truth she was noting the subtle choreography of glances and silences. Mrs. Redley speaking less than usual, Eleanor answering questions without embellishment, and Mr. Granger, the estate manager, avoiding Miss Marple's eyes altogether. In the afternoon, she took herself to the upper gallery, a long, narrow space lined with family portraits. Many bore the same high cheekbones and cool eyes as Mrs. Redley. One painting, however, caught Miss Marple's attention, a stern-faced man in naval uniform, his gaze holding a hint of defiance. She leaned closer, reading the small brass plate beneath. "Captain Thomas Redley, 1884 to 1911. She stood there for some minutes, reflecting on how certain family temperaments seemed to linger through the generations, much as certain family objects did. She was still thinking of this when she noticed a fine layer of dust disturbed near the base of a display cabinet. Something small had been moved recently, though when she peered inside, all appeared in order. Returning to her room, Miss Marple sat in the fading afternoon light, her knitting in her lap. The pattern of this house was beginning to emerge, faintly, like an old tapestry in need of restoration. She could see certain threads, fear, secrecy, and the faint glimmer of desperation. But one thread was still missing, the one that would bind the others into a coherent design. She knew it would come. Houses like Grange House could only keep their stories buried for so long. Chapter 6, Shadows in the Study. Study of Gresham Hollow had always felt like a place apart from the rest of the house, a room that seemed to carry its own temperature, its own rules, its own silence. It was paneled in dark oak, the walls lined with shelves heavy under the weight of books bound in leather so dry that some covers had begun to crack with age. A brass reading lamp sat on the broad desk, its green glass shade casting a muted glow, the only softness in a room that otherwise seemed built for secrets. Miss Marple entered first, followed by Inspector Arkwright, who was carrying a small ledger and wearing the expression of a man trying to make sense of something that refused to yield. "I think you ought to see this," he said, setting the ledger down on the desk. It was tucked inside the false back of the second drawer. Locked, of course, but our constable managed the key in the usual manner. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and leaned closer. "What is it?" "An accounts book, sort of. Names, dates, amounts of money, and a few odd symbols I can't place. Some entries are in code." She turned a page delicately, the paper whispering beneath her fingers. Yes. Very curious. The hand changes halfway through. This earlier section is precise, methodical, one might almost say obsessive. But here, she tapped the page, a different writer entirely. Faster, sloppier. Someone in a hurry, perhaps. Arkwright frowned. To people using the same hidden ledger? That doesn't sound right. It might. If the second did not know, the first would find out. He watched her in the dim lamplight, wondering, though he wouldn't admit it, how she always seemed to be 2 steps ahead in thought. From the doorway came the sound of hesitant footsteps. It was Clara Morton, the housemaid, clutching her apron in both hands. Beg pardon, sir, mum. I only thought I should mention I saw Mr. Harcourt in here the night before it happened. He had no lamp, just the firelight, and he was writing very fast, tearing a page out every now and then. Miss Marple turned slowly toward her. And you did not mention this sooner because? Clara looked at the floor. Because he told me it was none of my business. And he's always been kind to me. I didn't want trouble for him. Arkwright's voice was clipped. You understand withholding information can be, but Miss Marple interrupted gently. There is no harm in speaking now, my dear. You have done the right thing. She offered a faint smile. You said he tore out pages. Do you recall what he did with them? No. I just heard the rustle and saw him put something in his pocket. Then he left. When the girl had gone, Arkwright muttered, Harcourt again. Every time we turn something over, there's his name underneath. Yes, Miss Marple said absently, still studying the ledger. And yet, it might be too convenient. Arkwright gave a sharp laugh. Convenient? The man's up to his neck. Perhaps, or perhaps someone wants it to appear so. It is sometimes easier to plant suspicion than to remove it. The door creaked open again this time. Mr. Harcourt himself stood there. His usually composed manner seemed a fraction too controlled, his eyes flickering briefly to the ledger on the desk before settling on Miss Marple. I was told you wished to see me, he said, his voice smooth but taut. Yes, she replied mildly. We were just discussing how very diligent you seem in your work here. His brow furrowed. Work, I hardly think. The late hours in the study, she said softly. The tearing of pages. You see, someone noticed. Harcourt's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened at his side. Whatever I was writing was personal. It had nothing to do with the unfortunate events in this house. Miss Marple watched him with a gaze that seemed to pass through his words and examine what lay behind them. I see, and yet, when people hide their writings behind a false panel, it often suggests that someone else might wish to see them. He shifted. If you're implying... I imply nothing, she said, her voice even. But I would ask you one question, Mr. Harcourt. The symbols in this ledger, did you write them? For a heartbeat, his eyes betrayed something recognition, perhaps alarm before the mask returned. I've no idea what those are. When he had gone, Arkwright leaned in. Did you see that? He knew exactly what they meant. Miss Marple closed the ledger carefully. Yes, which means we must now determine not only what they mean, but why he would deny it. She stood, her figure small against the tall shelves, yet somehow commanding the entire room. Inspector, we must speak to Mrs. Redmayne next. I have the oddest feeling she knows more about these symbols than she realizes. As they left the study, the fire guttered low, shadows pooling in the corners as though something unseen was listening. Chapter 7. A candle in the attic wind had risen over St. Aldwyth's, howling between the gables and rattling the loose panes of the upstairs windows. Miss Marple, still seated in the old library, folded her knitting neatly into the basket beside her. Her eyes, sharp despite their gentle blue, had taken on the thoughtful gleam that the vicar always said meant she was assembling her troops. In that invisible battlefield of hers, it was not yet 10 o'clock, but the house seemed quieter than midnight. Mrs. Drake had retired early, claiming a headache. Young Lydia had drifted away to her room after a tense supper, her face pale as milk, and Peter Tolliver, the house's brooding lodger, had been nowhere to be found since he left the dining room with a muttered excuse about fresh air. The only sound was the faint ticking of the long case clock in the hallway. That, and Miss Marple paused the soft scrape of something above her head. She listened, head tilted slightly, like a sparrow alert to the rustle of a predator. There it was again, a faint dragging sound, as though someone were moving a heavy object across bare floorboards. And then a sharper noise, a drop, perhaps, or a small wooden box being set down with more force than intended. The attic. Miss Marple had already been told it was nothing but a store of trunks and moth-eaten rugs, yet the sound suggested occupation. She rose, the movement silent, and stepped into the hallway. The light from the library cast her shadow long along the carpet, and the boards gave a single muted creak under her slippered feet. At the foot of the attic stairs, she paused. The narrow wooden steps vanished into darkness. She reached for the lamp kept on the side table, its glow spilling over the first few treads. Slowly, she climbed. Halfway up, she froze. The scraping had stopped. Silence. When she reached the top landing, the air was colder. The smell of dust and cedar mixing with a faint, unpleasant tang, something like damp rope. She turned the lamp's beam across the low-ceilinged space. Trunks, stacked boxes, an old cradle missing one rocker dot, and there at the far end a faint flicker. Candlelight. Miss Marple moved forward slowly, her slippered steps making no sound on the boards. The candle sat in a brass holder atop a small writing desk. Next to it lay an open ledger, its pages cramped with careful handwriting. But it was not the book that held her attention, it was the drawer, left ajar, revealing the edge of what looked suspiciously like a folded parchment. She reached out and touched it. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but she could see, yes, what looked like a plan of the house. And on the plan, one room marked in red, a room she did not recognize. Footsteps creaked on the stairs behind her. Miss Marple turned, the lamp trembling ever so slightly in her hand. Lydia stood there, her dressing gown drawn tightly around her, her eyes darting to the desk and back to Miss Marple's face. "You shouldn't be here," Lydia whispered. Her voice trembled not with anger, but with something closer to fear. Miss Marple said nothing, only gestured lightly toward the desk. "An interesting map, my dear, but I confess, I do not recall seeing such a room on the house tour." Lydia's gaze flicked toward the parchment, and a faint flush rose in her cheeks. It's nothing. An old plan. That room doesn't even exist anymore." "Doesn't exist," Miss Marple repeated softly, as if the words themselves were a puzzle to be examined. "Yet someone has taken the trouble to mark it in red." Lydia stepped forward quickly, shutting the drawer with more force than necessary. "You must promise me you'll say nothing of this, please." Before Miss Marple could reply, the sound of a door slamming below made them both start. Heavy footsteps moved across the hallway downstairs. A man's voice called low, urgent though the words were indistinct. "Peter Tolliver." Lydia seemed to stiffen. She blew out the candle, plunging the attic into darkness save for the glow of Miss Marple's lamp. "Go," Lydia said in a fierce whisper. "Please just go back downstairs." Miss Marple descended without argument, her mind quietly alight. She did not miss, however, the soft click of the attic latch being turned from the inside. When she reached the library once more, the fire had burned low, casting the room in warm shadows. Peter Tolliver was there, standing near the window, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. He glanced at Miss Marple, his eyes quick and watchful, then said with forced casualness, "Strange night. Too much wind. Makes one think the house is alive, doesn't it?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, I think houses are rather like people, Mr. Tolliver. They do not come alive unless someone stirs them up." Peter's lips curved in something not quite a smile before he turned back to the window. As Miss Marple sat, she felt in her knitting bag the brittle parchment she had slipped away. When Lydia's attention faltered, a fragment, torn neatly from the larger map. On it was part of that same mysterious red outline, and she thought, with the faintest inward sigh, that this house still held far more rooms hidden, or otherwise, than its inhabitants were willing to admit. Chapter 8. A puzzle. In the attic following morning broke gray and still, the heavy clouds pressing low over the village of Little Brynford, as though nature herself conspired to muffle every sound. Miss Marple rose early, her mind already circling the events of the past days with quiet persistence. While the rest of the household moved about in a fog of polite restraint, she had determined upon a small but deliberate errand. After breakfast, she approached Mrs. Redley, who was already busying herself in the morning room with her embroidery. "My dear," Miss Marple began with the soft warmth of someone who seemed only to seek conversation, "I have been thinking of the house's age. I wonder, do you still make use of the attic?" Mrs. Redley looked up, blinking in faint surprise. "The attic? Oh, heavens, no. It's far too drafty and dusty. There are old trunks up there, left from before my late husband's time." "Why do you ask?" "Only idle curiosity," Miss Marple said with her characteristic mildness. "Old attics do tend to hold such interesting remnants of the past." She smiled as though the matter were trivial, but she noticed how Mrs. Redley's gaze flickered just once toward the narrow stairway door. At the far end of the hall. By late morning, The other guests had found excuses to be elsewhere. Mrs. Denholm had gone for a walk. To clear her thoughts, Mr. Hargreaves was reading by the fire, and young Lydia had been sent on some errand into the village. Miss Marple, alone and unnoticed, drifted toward the attic stairs. The narrow, steep climb was a trial for her knees, but she managed it with practiced patience, her hand firm on the polished wood banister. The air grew colder as she ascended, tinged with the scent of dust, mothballs, and something fainter metallic, almost like the scent of old coins or blood. At the top, the low-roofed space stretched before her in dim light from a small, cobweb-veiled window. She let her eyes adjust, noting the shapes of ancient trunks, a warped wardrobe, and a disused rocking chair that creaked softly as if moved by the draft. She moved carefully, her footfalls muffled on the old boards, until she came upon a large trunk pushed into a corner. It was locked, not unusual, but the brass padlock was new, shiny against the dust-covered wood. Miss Marple stooped, brushing away cobwebs, and saw that the floor beneath the trunk was oddly clean, as if it had been moved recently. "Curious," she murmured. Beside the trunk, a scrap of paper lay folded, half-tucked under a loose floorboard. She eased it free, noting the faint smudge of something reddish-brown along its edge. Unfolding it revealed a hurried, almost desperate scrawl. It's hidden where the light never touches, under the fourth step. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. She glanced toward the attic stairs, her mind instantly mapping their worn treads. Without replacing the note, she slipped it into her sleeve and descended, each step measured, listening for the creak of anyone approaching. Reaching the fourth step from the top, she noticed it sagged slightly more than the others. Kneeling ostensibly to adjust her shoe, she ran her fingers along the edge until she felt the faint give of a loose plank. With a quiet lift, she revealed a shallow hollow beneath, lined with cloth. Inside was an object wrapped in dark velvet. She did not remove it, at least, not yet. The weight and shape beneath her fingertips told her enough. A small, rectangular case, heavy for its size. She replaced it exactly as she had found it, her expression unreadable. Descending fully, she stepped back into the main hall just as Mrs. Denholm returned, shaking off her coat. "Miss Marple, you look as though you've been exploring," she remarked lightly. "Poe, just stretching my legs," Miss Marple replied, her tone airy. But inwardly, her mind was whirring. The attic, the note, the hidden case, these were no accidents. Someone in the household had placed it there. And if she had learned anything over the years, it was that such secrets seldom slept peacefully for long. That afternoon, she took tea with Inspector Graves in the quiet corner of the drawing room, keeping her voice low. "There's something you should see," she murmured, recounting her discovery in precise detail, omitting nothing. The inspector's brow furrowed as he listened, though he made no move to investigate immediately. "Better we keep it between ourselves for now," he said at last. "If the person who hid it suspects we know, they'll move it or worse." Miss Marple nodded in agreement. "Quite so. And I should like to watch them a little longer, Inspector. People do reveal the most interesting truths when they think their secrets are still safe." That evening, as the rain began to patter softly against the windows, the house seemed to close in upon itself. Shadows stretched along the corridors, and the lamplight flickered in a way that set one's nerves on edge. Somewhere upstairs, a floorboard creaked, but when Miss Marple looked up the staircase, there was nothing. She returned to her knitting, but her eyes were fixed not on the needles, but on the faces of those around her. Someone here knew about the attic. Someone here had placed that object under the fourth step, and sooner rather than later, she meant to know exactly who. Chapter 10. Shadows over the bridge. The mist had thickened by the time Poirot and I stepped outside the lantern-lit bridge inn. The air was cold, curling in silvery ribbons along the cobblestones, shrouding the edges of the riverbank and making the lanterns glow like orbs. Suspended in nothingness, the village itself seemed to have retreated further into silence, as if the night had pressed its hand against every door and window to keep the world from interfering. Poirot, ever sensitive to the quiet, walked slowly, his cane tapping softly. "Mon ami," he said, without turning his head. "It is at this hour, when the world is still, that the mind sees most clearly. The noise of the day has been silenced, and the lies people tell themselves fade away. I pulled my coat tighter. It also feels, I muttered, like the hour when unpleasant things happen. You have that expression again. The one that means we are walking directly into something unpleasant. He gave the smallest of smiles. Perhaps, but one must go to the unpleasant place to find the truth. The narrow lane ended abruptly at the bridge itself, a delicate stone span over the water, its balustrades adorned with wrought iron lanterns, their flames fluttering. Beneath, the current whispered rather than roared, winding away into darkness, that we were not alone. A tall, thin figure was leaning on the bridge's parapet, head bowed, hands hidden in the folds of a heavy coat. The man turned when we approached, revealing the pale, angular face of Mr. Elric Sloane, the reclusive clockmaker, whose shop we had passed earlier that day. Poirot inclined his head. Monsieur Sloane, a curious are to be enjoying the river. The man's eyes, sharp and restless, darted between us. Couldn't sleep, he said flatly. Too much noise in my head. I understand, Poirot murmured. It is the same for me when a puzzle remains unsolved. And yet, I think you are not here only for the fresh air. Sloane's lips twitched, as if he might deny it, but instead, he looked away, his voice low. Things are moving in this village, Monsieur Poirot. Things that should be left alone. You're asking questions that will make people nervous. That, Poirot said softly, is often the point. I noticed Sloane's hands then, pale against the darkness, fingers tapping together in a rhythmic, mechanical pattern. The way he moved was unsettling, as though he was calculating something behind his gaze. Before I could speak, Poirot asked, "And you, monsieur, are you nervous?" Sloane gave a hollow laugh. "I've been nervous for 20 years. There was a silence between us, filled only by the hiss of the river. Then, with a sudden shift in posture, Sloane straightened. I shouldn't be seen talking to you." But he paused, glancing toward the far end of the bridge. "Watch the light in the third window of the inn tonight. If it flickers twice, it means someone has left for the bridge. If it flickers 3 times, it means you've run out of time." And with that, he moved away, disappearing into the fog without a backward glance. Poirot's eyes followed him until he was gone. An interesting man, Hastings. He tells us something without telling us anything. But it is the manner in which he tells it that matters. We returned to the inn with a strange heaviness pressing between us. The common room was nearly empty, save for a young serving girl wiping down the tables. Poirot ordered tea, though I noticed he hardly touched it. His gaze kept drifting toward the narrow staircase that led to the upper floors. The hours passed in a tense, muffled stillness. The fire had burned low, leaving the room awash in amber shadows. At one point, Poirot leaned forward, whispering, "Regard, Hastings, the third window." I turned, heart quickening. Up in the dim corridor above, the third window facing the bridge flickered once, twice. Poirot was on his feet immediately. "Come, mon ami. The theater begins." We slipped out into the cold once more, the mist now so thick it seemed to swallow the lantern light whole. As we reached the bridge, a shape emerged ahead of us, smaller than Sloane, moving quickly and glancing over their shoulder. I caught the outline of a hood pulled low over the head. Poirot's pace slowed deliberately. "Do not startle them, Hastings. Let us see where they go." The figure reached the middle of the bridge, paused, and then, to my shock, bent down, hands working at something wedged between the stones of the balustrade. Before we could draw closer, the hooded figure straightened sharply, clearly having noticed us. They bolted, darting past us in a blur, the scent of damp wool and earth trailing behind. I instinctively turned to give chase, but Poirot caught my arm. Non. The important thing is not who they are, yet, but what they left behind." We approached the spot where they had been crouched. From the gap in the stone, Poirot drew out a small, oilskin-wrapped bundle. His eyes gleamed in the lantern light. "Ah, very interesting indeed." "What is it?" I asked, peering over his shoulder. But Poirot merely smiled, that infuriating, knowing smile. "Something that will make tomorrow most instructive." The river whispered below, the lanterns swayed gently above, and somewhere in the mist behind us, I could have sworn I heard the echo of hurried footsteps. Watching, waiting.